My name is Dan Faughnan. I was recruited into the Canadian Security Intelligence Service in 1990. Spent the first couple of years working in the headquarters as a desk officer, basically as a case manager for operations that were occurring in our regional offices. Following that time, I spent quite a few years out in our regional offices, which I guess in the US would be referred to as field offices or stations. I was posted all throughout Canada throughout my career and abroad. Spent some time in Western Europe, spent a year in Afghanistan, very unique experience for us. My background was human source recruitment and running. Subsequently, a lot of management activity up to assistant director level, so assistant deputy minister and sort of government parlance. My career trajectory, especially in the first 5, 6 years, was filled with both operations and a lot of training. And the organization at that particular time, it was many years ago, focused and recognized the requirement that both intelligence officers and analysts required not only initial training, but ongoing training and evaluation in terms of professionalizing them. Because the service, as you may know, was spawned off from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Security Service. And going from a police service to a security intelligence service took some work, both from a cultural perspective as well as a training perspective. So my early years were filled regularly with training regimes, both in class and practical exercising. So we became culturally used to constantly either undergoing or delivering training. And that included even times when we went out to regional offices, usually prior to every posting that we had, people would have to undergo some form of training. So it was embedded in us culturally as well as practically. When people come into the service, they think they have an understanding of what a security intelligence organization does, but they truly need to come to grips with some of the elements that require training. So for instance, the intelligence cycle. When we come into the organization, we have a sense of what we see in popular culture, but we don't realize that there's really a systematic approach to what we do to collect, analyze information, and provide that advice to government. So understanding and training to understand the intelligence cycle becomes critical at the outset. And we spend a lot of time teaching young employees and then them doing self-study to understand that cycle. We provide, and then the organization provides analytical training at the outset to help people understand, one, how to process information, to collate it, to corroborate that information and provide it as advice to government. But it's important that they understand that, because when they get into their specialization area, they subsequently have to also learn the area of interest that they're assigned to. And it cannot be simply a superficial level of understanding. So, in Canada, we can't expect to understand an issue by simply reading the Globe and Mail. There has to be their ongoing, I call it a vocational interest in a particular subject, whether that includes, language training and such, but it certainly includes a lot of historical and sort of a political science bent to the area that they're interested in, because the government expects us to have a better understanding of that issue than certainly the average citizen. And at times, coupled with the analytical component of the organization, it's expected that we will be able to provide very unique and learned advice to government so that policymakers can make decisions. So teaching that cycle, having people understand what happens to the information that you collect and what happens to it after it's analyzed. What impact does it have on the decision-making and policymaking process? This occurs at the outset of somebody's career, but it's really an exercise that occurs all throughout their career. We have to revisit those issues. We don't collect in a void. We collect based on objectives and requirements that are set out by government. So all those elements have to figure into the educational process. Ideally, they would figure into the education process before somebody applies to the organization. Historically, that wasn't really the case. There wasn't a lot of intelligence education out in the world. There was political science, strategic studies. Now I think we're having people think about something more specialized in preparing themselves for a career in the intelligence community. Let me start with the critical thinking element, because that's probably the most important element of this part of the discussion. My wife is a teacher and has been a teacher for over 35 years, and she's very, very heavily weighted to teaching and demanding critical thinking from students. Having said that, there can be a tendency in the education system not to demand critical thinking in various curriculum efforts. They talk the talk, but there's not as much evidence in the production of our student population. In the post-secondary side, speaking from personal experience, my undergraduate experience did not prepare me well for a career in security intelligence, because it was very broad. My graduate program, because I could tailor it to some extent with advisors, I was able to tailor it much more to providing me a greater base in critical thinking skills, and had the practice from an academic perspective. In the organization itself, over an evolution of 30, 40 years, the organization started to recognize that need for greater skill sets and practices that focused on critical thinking skills. And so we started to work a little bit with academia to provide that. Fundamentally, an increasing sophistication brought into the organization resulted in part in academia reacting to that and saying, okay, now we have an organization that wants this level of sophistication in the education process, undergraduate and graduate programs. So there was a response to that. And in Canada, there's been a number of universities that have spawned programs that either are directly focused on entering the IC, the intelligence community, or at least respect the requirements that are more broad. Are they effective? I think that's a time will tell issue, because young people coming into the space, I seem to see, are struck by the demand of that, for that critical thinking. They're not as used to it. The impact of technology, the ease upon which students can obtain information without having to work too hard in research, might actually pose a problem, or could open the door for greater efforts to focus on critical thinking skills. But I think students have to be much, much more deliberate in how they pursue their educations. It's insufficient to simply let the education happen. They have to demand to be taught those skills, or to really practice those skills along the way. So there's going to have to be a combination. Whether students coming into it now are fully aware of that requirement and can direct their own learning, I'm not sure. That's something I'll leave to academia to assess. The two immediate challenges folks coming in right now. First one is access to technology. So, Gen Z and beyond have grown up, born and raised with ready access to technology that looks outward into the world. The S&I community fundamentally has been inward looking and relies on information that is accessible only to itself from inside the organizations, and has historically limited access to information in the outside world on a regular basis. So young people coming in, it could be a small an anecdote, they're told, oh, you have to leave your telephone at the front, locked up in the front. Young people coming in are shocked by that. Well, what do you mean I can't take my phone to my desk? Well, because your phone could be penetrated by an adversary and, could be collecting information. So that's a shocker. I'd say the second one that could become a significant challenge is the concept of remote work. Whether we like it or not, most work in the IC has to be done on site, unless you're out in the world, doing your core business. So if I'm out recruiting human source, obviously I've got to leave the office. But the idea of working from home isn't really an option right now in the IC, unless you're on the support side, maybe administration, finance, and some of those elements. But people have to accept when they come into a career in the intelligence community, you're going to be working on site in a highly sensitive zone, and you're not going to be able to have access to the world outside during your 8-hour day for the most part. Now, the IC can do some work in that regard in creating technologies that allow some of that exterior access. And I've had some experience with that. But the IC also needs to be a little bit more forward leaning with regard to this demographic shift. They need to clearly understand that young people coming in will want that access, and they have to figure out a way to give them some elements of that access without compromising national security, obviously. We used to call them the like-minded, right? So the medium-sized and smaller countries that have a capability, they have requirements, they have objectives, but they don't necessarily have the capacity to do it all. So in the smaller countries, of which we align with quite a few of them in different forms of alliances, we specialize and share. So we all have our areas that we have greater skill sets and experience with, and we share those. And I think that will become much more prevalent in the next few years as we face concerns and threats from a variety of areas. We live in a very, very interesting time right now, and we have to consider that. We've lived in a pretty benign environment from an ally perspective for the last 70 years. Maybe now we have to realize that we are a sovereign, in this case of Canada, we're a sovereign state, but we cannot work alone, and nor should we have to work alone. So smaller countries can collaborate and can increase the volume of that collaboration while remaining sovereign. But that's something that I think has been ongoing for a number of years. Smaller countries do. I've worked with many smaller states and medium-sized states over the years, not just the big partners, although those relationships are critically important. People coming into the community need to really broaden their understanding of those communities. They need to travel, need to get out. And I'm not talking about traveling down to Dominican Republic to sit on the beach. They need to get in the world and live in that world, preferably before coming into the IC, so that they come in with a little bit of life experience with that. Not that other life experiences aren't also important, but there needs to be a stronger, much stronger level of sophistication, and specifically to the Canadian experience. I have noted in the past that many people coming to the IC did not have a lot of travel and travel work experience. It's not a necessity, but it's definitely a leg up if you can
Mhm.
demonstrate that you've been out in the world, had experiences, some good, some challenging. You bring that with you into an organization, which helps you enhance your own sophistication, which subsequently contributes to the success of the mission. And this is something that I always encourage students: travel, learn skills, come into the organizations with a variety of backgrounds, but know that the demands on you, the level of sophistication and the effort you put in the IC has to be elevated. It is insufficient to come in as a former copper, as it was in the 70s and the 60s, because things aren't as simple as they had been at that time. The recruiters, I think, have always been a little bit behind the trend in terms of what kind of talent is out there, what do young potential employees want and need from their organizations. We've seen some fairly significant cultural shifts over the last 20 years with regard to how people see themselves being recruited, what they want from their career. We went through that phase where we had to realize that many people would go through multiple careers in a lifetime. So the idea of a lifetime career in one thing, I was a lifer in my organization. I had previous experience in the military, but I'd never thought of it in terms of, well, I'll do this for 10 years and move on,
Mm.
which means we have to, recruiters and trainers need to understand that you need to front load the training and experiences early to be able to get productivity out of people coming to the community. I'm always of the hope that people come into the intelligence community and see it as a passion, as a vocation. They want to stay with it, but realizing that it's not for everybody and they want to have a life of varied experiences. So recruiters need to accept that. Recruiters need to do a better job, in my humble opinion, at evaluation. Not more evaluation. That's not the answer. A better evaluation, an evaluation of potential. We say often in the private sector, you hire for character and you train for skill. That doesn't mean coming in with no skills at all. It means we need to accept that people need to come in with a certain mindset into the community, because it's a different mindset. And often young recruits realize that fairly quickly when they come in. They come in with a perspective, which is fine, and they quickly are not necessarily dissuaded with that perspective, but they realize that it's more complicated than that. Those that are successful can embrace that chaos. They can come into it saying, "Oh, okay, this is really interesting," and accept that and work with it and develop within it in their training and professional development. Those that are unsuccessful are either disillusioned because it's not what they thought. I was using the analogy of Walter Mitty the other day with somebody, and it was a young person, and they said, "Who's Walter Mitty?" So I had to explain that idea of a fantasy life, not coming in thinking it's because the James Bond film, but looking at it as a vocation dedicated to serving in the case the state and the people of that state with good information. When young, and particularly Canadians, when they come in, they are shocked to realize that we are effectively, and have been for a number of years, in a hybrid conflict with certain adversaries. We are in that conflict now. So when that realization hits them and it becomes internalized, they suddenly take their career aspirations and efforts much more seriously. So I will say to young people, this isn't a game. Well, I realize that the training is part of it, but when you get to the job, it is a very serious business, and you have to be a serious player to engage that business. And again, most people adapt well, and off they go. I would suggest simply that somebody who's looking for a lucrative career would be, quite frankly, better off looking elsewhere if that's the driving force. And understanding that every employee wants to be paid a fair salary or wage. I don't disagree. I think it actually is quite a well-paying job. In my career, I never felt wanting when I compared myself with friends of mine who'd gone on to the private sector. Most of them, in further, in in-depth discussions, came to realize that I had it way better in terms of the job satisfaction one I had. So I was talking to somebody about this the other day, and they said, I would do this job for free if I was independently wealthy. Like, that's the passion. So it can't be about the money. It shouldn't be about the money. It shouldn't be about, quote unquote, the glory. It should be about a desire to make a difference in your broader community and to contribute to a maintenance of stability. The issue of obsolescence is that, I will say, it's a real issue, but then it's not really a real issue. I know when I joined, we all thought it was, the technology that I had before I joined was more advanced in some respects. But then, there's a leap in technology and advancements in the organizations, and all of the organizations, although it is a bit slower than it might be in a private sector company, it does happen, and it happens sort of in steps and stages. And when it happens, it contributes, but the work still gets done, even though it's not necessarily the most advanced technology. For instance, take the development of AI tools. Friends of mine in various parts of the community who are now talking, quite readily about the adoption of AI related tools, and so they're there. It just it took them a couple of years to kind of have the light go on. Whether it's always a game of catch up. That's just government. The government writ large has always somewhat catch up, but once it catches up, it's quite functional. I think to be honest, I think the biggest issue right now in the NIC in Canada, and I think in many of the smaller democracies and middle-sized democracies, is the issue of risk aversion. That at the leadership level, these organizations need to come to grips with the fact that we live in a very volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. And so the idea of taking risks, we used to use the term responsible risk taking, which I always thought was a misnomer because it's a contrary statement. You can't call it a responsible risk. It wouldn't be a risk then if it was responsible. So the organizations themselves, as they need to, will start to take greater risk, including with things like technological advancement, recruitment, and training and retention issues, knowing that the demographic demands it. On the other side, the demographic will need to learn a little bit of strategic patience, that you're in an organization that has, it serves at the will of government, but the focus on the mission of service and providing learned advice to government so they can make good policy decisions, that remains regardless of what the technology is. So I always suggest to people, don't use that as an excuse not to do your job to the best of your ability.
Dan, thank you very much for your participation.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.